Chapter the 5th. Oliver mingles with new associates and, going to a funeral for the first time, forms an unfavorable notion of his master's business. Oliver, being left to himself in the undertaker's shop, set the lamp down on a workman's bench and gazed timidly about him, with a feeling of awe and dread which many people a good deal older than Oliver will be at no loss to understand. An unfinished coffin on black trestles, which stood in the middle of the shop, looked so gloomy and death-like that a cold tremble came over him every time his eyes wandered in the direction of the dismal object, from which he almost expected to see some frightful form slowly rear its head to drive him mad with terror. Against the wall were ranged in regular array a long row of elm boards cut into the same shape, and looking in the dim light like high-shouldered ghosts with their hands in their breeches pockets. Coffin plates, elm chips, bright-headed nails, and shreds of black cloth lay scattered on the floor, and the wall above the counter was ornamented with a lively representation of two mutes in very stiff neckcloths, on duty at a large private door, with a hearse drawn by 4 black steeds approaching in the distance. The shop was close and hot, and the atmosphere seemed tainted with the smell of coffins. The recess beneath the counter in which his flock mattress was thrust looked like a grave. Nor were these the only dismal feelings which depressed Oliver. He was alone in a strange place, and we all know how chilled and desolate the best of us will sometimes feel in such a situation. The boy had no friends to care for or to care for him. The regret of no recent separation was fresh in his mind. The absence of no loved and well-remembered face sunk heavily into his heart, but his heart was heavy notwithstanding, and he wished, as he crept into his narrow bed, that there were his coffin, that were his coffin, and that he could be laid in a calm and lasting sleep in the churchyard ground, with the tall grass waving gently above his head, and the sound of the old deep bell to soothe him in his sleep. Oliver was awakened in the morning by loud kicking at the outside of the shop door, which, before he could huddle on his clothes, was repeated in an angry and impetuous manner about 25 times, and when he began to undo the chain, the legs left off their volleys, and a voice began. "Open the door, will ya?" cried the voice which belonged to the legs which had kicked at the door. "I will directly, sir," replied Oliver, undoing the chain and turning the key. "I suppose you're the new boy, ain't ya?" said the voice through the keyhole. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. "How old are you?" inquired the voice. 11, sir," replied Oliver. "Then I'll whop yer when I get in," said the voice. "You just see if I don't, that's all. My work's a sprat." And having made this obliging promise, the voice began to whistle. Oliver had been too often subject to the process to which the very expressive monosyllable just recorded bears reference, to entertain the smallest doubt that the owner of the voice, whoever he might be, would redeem his pledge most honorably. He drew back the bolts with a trembling hand and opened the door. For a second or two, Oliver glanced up the street, and down the street, and all over the way, impressed with the belief that the unknown who had addressed him through the keyhole had walked a few paces off to warm himself. For nobody did Oliver see but a big charity boy sitting on the post in front of the house, eating a slice of bread and butter, which he cut into wedges the size of his mouth with a clasp knife, and then consumed with great dexterity. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver at length, seeing that no other visitor made his appearance. "Did you knock?" "I kicked," replied the charity boy. "Did you want a coffin, sir?" inquired Oliver, innocently. At this, the charity boy looked monstrous fierce, and said that Oliver would stand in need of one before long if he cut jokes with his superiors in that way. "You don't know who I am, I suppose, workhouse," said the charity boy in continuation. Descending from the top of the post, meanwhile, with edifying gravity. "No, sir," rejoined Oliver. "I'm Mr. Noah Claypole," said the charity boy, "and you're under me. Take down the shutters, you idle young ruffian." With this, Mr. Claypole administered a kick to Oliver, and entered the shop with a dignified air, which did him great credit. It is difficult for a large-headed, small-eyed youth, of lumbering make and heavy countenance, to look dignified under any circumstances, but it is more especially so when superadded to these personal attractions are a red nose and yellow smalls. Oliver, having taken down the shutters and broken a pane of glass in his efforts to stagger away beneath the weight of the first one to a small court at the side of the house in which they were kept during the day, was graciously assisted by Noah, who, having consoled him with the assurance that he'd catch it, condescended to help him. Mr. Sowerberry came down soon after, and shortly afterwards Mrs. Sowerberry appeared, and Oliver, having caught it in fulfillment of Noah's prediction, followed that young gentleman downstairs to breakfast. "Come near the fire, Noah," said Charlotte. "I saved a nice little piece of bacon for you from master's breakfast. Oliver, shut that door at Mr. Noah's back, and take them bits that I put on the cover of the bread pan. That's your tea. Take it away to that box, and drink it there, and make haste, for they all want you to mind the shop. D'ye hear?" "D'ye hear, workhouse?" said Noah Claypole. "Lord, Noah," said Charlotte, "what a rum creature you are! Why don't you let the boy alone?" "Let him alone?" said Noah. "Why, everybody's let him alone enough, for the matter of that. Neither his father nor mother will ever interfere with him. All his relations let him have his own way pretty well. Eh, Charlotte?" "Oh, you queer soul," said Charlotte, bursting into a hearty laugh, in which she was joined by Noah, after which they both looked scornfully at poor Oliver Twist, as he sat, shivering, upon the box in the coldest corner of the room, and ate the stale pieces which had been specially reserved for him. Noah was a charity boy, but not a workhouse orphan. No chance child was he, for he could trace his genealogy back all the way to his parents, who lived hard by, his mother being a washerwoman, and his father a drunken soldier, discharged with a wooden leg, and a diurnal pension of 2 pence halfpenny, and an unstatable fraction. The shop boys in the neighborhood had long been in the habit of branding Noah in the public streets with the ignominious epithets of leathers, charity, and the like. And Noah had borne them without reply, but now that fortune had cast in his way a nameless orphan, at whom even the meanest could point the finger of scorn, he retorted on him with interest. This affords charming food for contemplation. It shows us what a beautiful thing human nature is, and how impartially the same amiable qualities are developed in the finest lord and the dirtiest charity boy. Oliver had been sojourning at the undertaker's some 3 weeks or a month, and Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry, the shop being shut up, were taking their supper in the little back parlor, when Mr. Sowerberry, after several deferential glances at his wife, said, "My dear, He was going to say more, but Mrs. Sowerberry, looking up with a peculiarly unpropitious aspect, he stopped short. "Well?" said Mrs. Sowerberry sharply. "Nothing, my dear, nothing," said Mr. Sowerberry. "Ugh, you brute," said Mrs. Sowerberry. "Not at all, my dear," said Mr. Sowerberry humbly. "I thought you didn't want to hear, my dear. I was only going to say—" "Oh, don't tell me what you were going to say," interposed Mrs. Sowerberry. "I am nobody. Don't consult me, pray. Pray. I don't want to intrude upon your secrets." And as Mrs. Sowerberry said this, she gave an hysterical laugh which threatened violent consequences. "But, my dear," said Mr. Sowerberry, "I want to ask your advice." No, don't ask mine," replied Mrs. Sowerberry in an affecting manner. "Ask somebody else's." Here there was another hysterical laugh, which frightened Mr. Sowerberry very much. This is a very common and much approved matrimonial course of treatment, which is often very effective. It at once reduced Mr. Sowerberry to begging as a special favor to be allowed to say what Mrs. Sowerberry was most curious to hear, and after a short altercation of less than 3/4 of an hour's duration, the permission was most graciously conceded. "It's only about young Twist, my dear," said Mr. Sowerberry. "A very good-looking boy, that, my dear." "He need be, for he eats enough," observed the lady. "There's an expression of melancholy in his face, my dear," resumed Mr. Sowerberry, "which is very interesting. He would make a delightful mute, my dear." Mrs. Sowerberry looked up with an expression of considerable wonderment. Mr. Sowerberry remarked it, and without allowing time for any observation on the good lady's part, proceeded. "I don't mean a regular mute to attend grown-up people, my dear, but only for children's practice. It would be very new to have a mute in proportion, my dear. You may depend upon it that it would have a superb effect." Mrs. Sowerberry, who had a good deal of taste in the undertaking way, was much struck by the novelty of the idea, but as it would have been compromising her dignity to have said so under existing circumstances, she merely inquired with much sharpness why such an obvious suggestion had not presented itself to her husband's mind before. Mr. Sowerberry rightly construed this as an acquiescence in his proposition. It was speedily determined that Oliver should be at once initiated into the mysteries of the profession, and with this view, that he should accompany his master on the very next occasion of his services being required. The occasion was not long in coming. For half an hour after breakfast next morning, Mr. Bumble entered the shop, and supporting his cane against the counter, drew forth his large leathern pocket-book, from which he selected a small scrap of paper, which he handed over to Mr. Sowerberry. "Aha!" said the undertaker, glancing over it with a lively countenance. "An order for a coffin, eh?" "For a coffin first, and a parochial funeral afterwards," replied Mr. Bumble, fastening the strap of the leathern pocket-book, which, like himself, was very corpulent. "Baton," said the undertaker, looking from the scrap of paper to Mr. Bumble. "I never heard the name before." Bumble shook his head as he replied, "Obstinate people, Mr. Sowerberry, very obstinate. Proud, too, I'm afraid, sir." "Proud, eh?" exclaimed Mr. Sowerberry with a sneer. "Come, that's too much." Oh, it's sickening, replied replied the beetle. Perfectly antimonial, Mr. Sowerberry. So it is, acquiesced the undertaker. We only heard of them the night before last, said the beetle, and we shouldn't have known anything about them then. Only a woman who lodges in the same house made an application to the parochial committee for them to send the parochial surgeon to see a woman, as was very bad. He had gone out to dinner, but his prentice, which is a very clever lad, sent him some medicine in a blacking bottle offhand. Ah, there's promptness, said the undertaker. Promptness indeed, replied the beetle. But what's the consequence? What's the ungrateful behavior of those rebels, sir? Why, the husband sends back word that the medicine won't suit his wife's complaint, and so she shan't take it. Says she shan't take it, sir. Good, strong, wholesome medicine, as was given with great success to 2 Irish labourers and a coal heaver only a week before. Sent 'em for nothing, with the blacking bottle in, and he sends back word that she shan't take it, sir. As the flagrant atrocity presented itself to Mr. Bumble's mind in full force, he struck the counter sharply with his cane, and became flushed with indignation. Well, said the undertaker, I never did, sir, ejaculated the beetle. No, nor anybody ever did. No, but she's dead now. We've got to bury her, and that's the direction, and the sooner it's done, the better. Thus saying, Mr. Bumble put on his cocked hat wrong side first in a fever of parochial excitement, and flounced out of the shop. Why, he was so angry, Oliver, that he forgot even to ask after you, said Mr. Sowerberry, looking after the beetle as he strode down the street. Yes, sir, replied Oliver, who had carefully kept himself out of sight during the interview, and who was shaking from head to foot at the mere recollection of the sound of Mr. Bumble's voice. He needn't have taken the trouble to shrink from Mr. Bumble's glance, however, for that functionary, on whom the prediction of the gentleman in the white waistcoat had made a very strong impression, thought that now the undertaker had got Oliver upon trial, the subject was better avoided until such time as he should be firmly bound for 7 years, and all danger of his being returned upon the hands of the parish should be thus effectually and legally overcome. Well, said Mr. Sowerberry, taking up his hat, the sooner this job is done, the better. Noah, look after the shop. Oliver, put on your cap and come with me. Oliver obeyed and followed his master on his professional mission. They walked on for some time through the most crowded and densely inhabited part of the town, and then striking down a narrow street more dirty and miserable than any they had yet passed through, paused to look through for the house, which was the object of their search. The houses on either side were high and large, but very old, and tenanted by people of the poorest class. As their neglected appearance would have sufficiently denoted without the concurrent testimony afforded by the squalid looks of the few men and women who, with folded arms and bodies half doubled, occasionally skulked like shadows along. A great many of the tenements had shop fronts, but they were fast closed and mouldering away, only the upper rooms being inhabited. Others, which had become insecure from age and decay, were prevented from falling into the street by huge beams of wood which were reared against the tottering walls and firmly planted in the road. Even these crazy dens seemed to have been selected as the nightly haunts of some houseless wretches, for many of the rough boards which supplied the place of door and window were wrenched from their positions to afford an aperture wide enough for the passage of a human body. The kennel was stagnant and filthy. The very rats that here and there lay putrefying in its rottenness were hideous with famine. There was neither knocker nor bell handle at the open door where Oliver and his master stopped. So, groping his way cautiously through the dark passage, and bidding Oliver keep close to him, and not be afraid, the undertaker mounted to the top of the first flight of stairs. Stumbling against a door on the landing, rapped at it with his knuckles. It was opened by a young girl of 13 or 14. The undertaker at once saw enough of what the room contained to know it was the apartment to which he had been directed. He stepped in, and Oliver followed him. There was no fire in the room, but a man was crouching mechanically over the empty stove. An old woman, too, had drawn a low stool to the cold hearth, and was sitting beside him. There were some ragged children in another corner. In a small recess opposite the door there lay open the ground something covered with an old blanket. Oliver shuddered as he cast his eyes towards the place, and crept involuntarily closer to his master, for though it was covered up, the boy felt that it was a corpse. The man's face was thin and very pale, his hair and beard were grizzly, and his eyes were bloodshot. The old woman's face was wrinkled, her 2 remaining teeth protruded over her under lip, and her eyes were bright and piercing. Oliver was afraid to look at either her or the man. They seemed so like the rats he had seen outside. "Nobody shall go no here," said the man, starting "Nobody shall go near her," said the man, starting fiercely up as the undertaker approached the recess. "Keep back. Damn you. Keep back, if you've a life to lose." "Nonsense, my good man," said the undertaker, who was pretty well used to misery in all its shapes. "Nonsense." "I tell you," said the man, clenching his hands and stamping furiously on the floor, "I tell you I won't have her put into the ground. She couldn't rest there. The worms would worry, not eat her. She is so worn away." The undertaker offered no reply to this raving, but producing a tape from his pocket, knelt down for a moment by the side of the body. "Ah," said the man, bursting into tears and sinking on his knees at the feet of the dead woman. Kneel down, kneel round her, every one of you, and mark my words. I say she starved to death. I never knew how bad she was till the fever came upon her, and then her bones were starting through her skin. There was neither fire nor candle. She died in the dark. She couldn't even see her children's faces, though we heard her gasping out their names. I begged for her in the streets, and they sent me to prison. When I came back, she was dying, and all the blood in my heart was dried up, for they starved her to death. I swear it before the God that saw it, they starved her. He twined his hands in his hair, and with a loud scream rolled grovelling upon the floor, his eyes fixed and the foam gushing from his lips. The terrified children cried bitterly, but the old woman, who had hitherto remained as quiet as if she had been wholly deaf to all that passed, menaced them into silence, and having unloosened the man's cravat, who still remained extended on the ground, tottered towards the undertaker. "She was my daughter," said the old woman, nodding her head in the direction of the corpse, and speaking with an idiotic leer, more ghastly than even the presence of death itself. "Lord, Lord! Well, it is strange that I, who gave birth to her and was a woman then, should be alive and merry now, and she lying there so cold and stiff. Lord, Lord, to think of it, it's as good as a play, as good as a play." As the wretched creature mumbled and chuckled in her hideous merriment, the undertaker turned to go away. "Stop, stop," said the old woman in a loud whisper. "Will she be buried tomorrow, or next day, or tonight? I laid her out, and I must walk, you know. Send me a large cloak, a good warm one, for it's bitter cold. We should have cake and wine, too, before we go. Never mind, send some bread, only a loaf of bread, and a cup of water. Shall we have some bread, dear?" she said eagerly, catching at the undertaker's coat as he once more moved towards the door. "Yes, yes," said the undertaker, "of course, anything, everything." He disengaged himself from the old woman's grasp, and dragging Oliver after him, hurried away. The next day, the family, having been meanwhile relieved with a half-quartern loaf and a piece of cheese, left with them by Mr. Bumble himself, Oliver and his master returned to the miserable abode, where Mr. Bumble had already arrived, accompanied by 4 men from the workhouse, who were to act as bearers. An old black cloak had been thrown over the rags of the old woman and the man. The bare coffin, having been screwed down, was then hoisted on the shoulders of the bearers, and carried downstairs into the street. "Now you must put your best leg foremost, old lady," whispered Sowerberry in the old woman's ear. "We are rather late, and it won't do to keep the clergyman waiting. Move on, my men, as quick as you like." Thus directed, the bearers trotted on, under their light burden, and the 2 mourners kept as near them as they could. Mr. Bumble and Sowerberry walked at a good smart pace in front, and Oliver, whose legs were not as long as his master's, ran by the side. There was not so great a necessity for hurrying as Mr. Sowerberry had anticipated, however, for when they reached the obscure corner of the churchyard in which the nettles grew and the parish graves were made, the clergyman had not arrived, and the clerk, who was sitting by the vestry-room fire, seemed to think it by no means improbable that it might be an hour or so before he came. So they set the bier down on the brink of the grave, and the 2 mourners waited patiently in the damp clay, with the cold rain drizzling down, while the ragged boys, whom the spectacle had attracted into the churchyard, played a noisy game at hide-and-seek among the tombstones, or varied their amusements by jumping backwards and forwards over the coffin. Mr. Sowerberry and Bumble, being personal friends of the clerk, sat by the fire with him, and read the paper. At length, after the lapse of something more than an hour, Mr. Bumble and Sowerberry and the clerk were seen running towards the grave, and immediately afterwards the clergyman appeared, putting on his surplice as he came along. Mr. Bumble then threshed a boy or two to keep up appearances, and the reverend gentleman, having read as much of the burial service as could be compressed into 4 minutes, gave his surplice to the clerk, and ran away again. "Now, Bill," said Sowerberry to the grave digger, "fill up." It was no very difficult task, for the grave was so full that the uppermost coffin was within a few feet of the surface. The grave digger shoveled in the earth, stamped it loosely down with his feet, shouldered his spade, and walked off, followed by the boys, who murmured very loud complaints at the fun being over so soon. "Come, my good fellow," said Bumble, tapping the man on the back. "They want to shut up the yard." The man, who had never once moved since he had taken his station by the graveside, started, raised his head, stared at the person who had addressed him, walked forward for a few paces, and then fell down in a fit. The crazy old woman was too much occupied in bewailing the loss of her cloak, which the undertaker had taken off, to pay him any attention, so they threw a can of cold water over him, and when he came to, saw him safely out of the churchyard, locked the gate, and departed on their different ways. "Well, Oliver," said Sowerberry as they walked home, "how do you like it?" "Pretty well, thank you, sir," replied Oliver with considerable hesitation. "Not very much, sir." "Ah, you'll get used to it in time, Oliver," said Sowerberry. "Nothing when you are used to it, my boy." Oliver wondered in his own mind whether it had taken a very long time to get Mr. Sowerberry used to it, but he thought it better not to ask the question, and walked back to the shop, thinking over all he had seen and heard. In great families, when an advantageous place cannot be obtained, either in possession, reversion, remainder, or expectancy, for the young man who is growing up, it is a very general custom to send him to sea. The board, in imitation of so wise and salutary an example, took counsel together on the expediency of shipping off Oliver Twist in some small trading vessel, bound to good, unhealthy port, which suggested itself as the very best thing that could possibly be done with him, the probability being that the skipper would either flog him to death in a playful mood some day after dinner, or knock his brains out with an iron bar, both pastimes being, as is pretty generally known, very favorite and common recreations among gentlemen of that class. The more the case presented itself to the board in this point of view, the more manifold the advantages of the step appeared, so they came to the conclusion that the only way of providing for Oliver effectually was to send him to sea without delay. Mr. Bumble had been dispatched to make various preliminary inquiries with a view of finding out some captain or other who wanted a cabin boy without any friends, and was returning to the workhouses to communicate the result of his mission, when he encountered just at the gate no less a person than Mr. Sowerberry. Was elastic, and his face betokened inward pleasantry, as he advanced to Mr. Bumble and shook him cordially by the hand. "I have taken the measure of the 2 women that died last night, Mr. Bumble," said the undertaker. "You'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," said the beadle, as he thrust his thumb and forefinger into the proffered snuff-box of the undertaker, which was an ingenious little model of a patent coffin. "I say you'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," repeated Mr. Bumble, tapping the undertaker on the shoulder in a friendly manner, with his cane. "Think so," said the undertaker in a tone which half admitted and half disputed the probability of the event. "The prices allowed by the board are very small, Mr. Bumble." "So are the coffins," replied the beadle, with precisely as near an approach to a laugh as a great official ought to indulge in. Mr. Sowerberry was much tickled at this, and of course he ought to be, and laughed a long time, without cessation. "Well, well, Mr. Bumble," he said at length, "there's no denying that, since the new system of feeding has come in, the coffins are something narrower and more shallow than they used to be. But we must have some profit, Mr. Bumble. Well-seasoned timber is an expensive article, sir, and all the iron handles come by canal from Birmingham." "Well, well," said Mr. Bumble, "every trade has its drawbacks, and a fair profit is of course allowable." Of course," replied the undertaker, "and if I don't get a profit upon this or that particular article, why, I make it up in the long run, you see." "Just so," said Mr. Bumble. "Though I must say," continued the undertaker, resuming the current of observations which the beadle had interrupted, "though I must say, Mr. Bumble, that I have to contend against everyone, very great disadvantage, which is, that all the stout people go off the quickest. I mean that the people who have been better off and have paid rates for many years are the first to sink when they come into the house. And let me tell you, Mr. Bumble, that 3 or 4 inches over one's calculation makes a great hole in one's profits, especially when one has a family to provide for, sir." As Mr. Sowerberry said this with becoming indignation of an ill-used man, and as Mr. Bumble felt that it had rather tended to convey a reflection on the honor of the parish, the latter gentleman thought it advisable to change the subject, and Oliver Twist being uppermost in his mind, he made him his theme. "By the by," said Mr. Bumble, "you don't know anybody who wants a boy, do you? A parochial apprentice, who is at present a dead weight, a millstone, as I may say, round the parochial throat. Liberal terms, Mr. Sowerberry, liberal terms." And as Mr. Bumble spoke, he raised his cane to the bill above him, and gave 3 distinct raps upon the words £5, which were printed therein in Roman capitals of gigantic size. "Gadzoo," said the undertaker, taking Mr. Bumble by the gilt-edged lapel of his official coat, "that's just the very thing I wanted to speak to you about. You know, dear me, what a very elegant button this is, Mr. Bumble. I never noticed it before." "Yes, I think it is rather pretty," said the beadle, glancing proudly downwards at the large brass buttons which embellished his coat. "Buttons. The die is the same as the parochial seal, the Good Samaritan healing the sick and bruised man. The board presented it to me on New Year's morning, Mr. Sowerberry. I put it on, I remember, for the first time to attend the inquest on that reduced tradesman who died in a doorway at midnight. I recollect," said the undertaker, "the jury brought in, 'died from exposure to the cold and want of the common necessaries of life,' didn't they?" Mr. Bumble nodded. "And they made it a special verdict, I think," said the undertaker, "by adding some words to the effect, that if the relieving officer had—" "Tush! Foolery!" interposed the beadle angrily. "If the board attended to all the nonsense that ignorant jurymen talk, they'd have enough to do."
Very true, said the undertaker. They would indeed. Juries, said Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane tightly, as was his wont when working into a passion. Juries is uneducated, vulgar, grovelling wretches. So they are, said the undertaker. They haven't no more philosophy or political economy about 'em than that, said the beadle, snapping his fingers contemptuously. No more they have, acquiesced the undertaker. I despise 'em, said the beadle, growing very red in the face. So do I, rejoined the undertaker. And I only wish we'd a jury of the independent sort in the house for a week or two, said the beadle. The rules and regulations of the board would soon bring their spirit down for them. Let 'em alone for that, replied the undertaker. So saying, he smiled approvingly to calm the rising wrath of the indignant parish officer. Mr. Bumble lifted off his cocked hat, took a handkerchief from the inside of the crown, wiped from his forehead the perspiration, which his rage had engendered, fixed the cocked hat on again, and turning to the undertaker, said, in a calmer voice, Well, what about the boy? Oh, replied the undertaker, why, you know, Mr. Bumble, I pay a good deal towards the poor's rates. Damn it! Said Mr. Bumble. Well, replied the undertaker, I was thinking that if I pay so much towards him, I've a right to get as much out of him as I can, Mr. Bumble, and so, I think I'll take the boy myself. Mr. Bumble grasped the undertaker by the arm and led him into the building. Mr. Sowerberry was closeted with the board for 5 minutes, and then it was arranged that Oliver should go to him that evening upon liking, a phrase which means, in the case of a parish apprentice, that if the master find upon a short trial that he can get enough work out of a boy without putting too much food in him, he shall have him for a term of years to do what he likes with. When little Oliver was taken before the gentleman that evening, and informed that he was to go that night as general house-lad to a coffin-maker's, and that if he complained of his situation, or ever came back to the parish again, he would be sent to sea, there to be drowned, or knocked on the head, as the case might be, he evinced so little emotion that they by common consent pronounced him a hardened young rascal, and ordered Mr. Bumble to remove him forthwith. Now, although it was very natural that the board of all the people in the world should feel in a great state of virtuous astonishment and horror at the smallest tokens of want of feeling on the part of anybody, they were rather out in this particular instance. The simple fact was that Oliver, instead of possessing too little feeling, possessed rather too much, and was in a fair way of being reduced to a state of brutal stupidity and sullenness for life by the ill usage he had received. He heard the news of his destination in perfect silence, and having had his luggage put into his hand, which was not very difficult to carry, inasmuch as it was all comprised within the limits of a brown paper parcel about 1/2 foot square by 3 inches deep, he pulled his cap over his eyes, and once more attaching himself to Mr. Bumble's coat cuff, was led away by that dignitary to a new scene of suffering. For some time Mr. Bumble drew Oliver along, without notice or remark, for the beadle carried his head very erect, as a beadle always should, and it being a windy day, little Oliver was completely enshrouded by the skirts of Mr. Bumble's coat, as they blew open and disclosed to great advantage his flapped waistcoat and drab plush knee breeches. As they drew near to their destination, however, Mr. Bumble thought it expedient to look down and see that the boy was in good order for inspection by his new master, which he accordingly did with a fit and becoming air of gracious patronage. "Oliver," said Mr. Bumble. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver in a low, tremulous voice. "Pull that cap off your eyes and hold up your head, sir." Although Oliver did as he was desired at once, and passed the black back of his unaccompanied, unoccupied hand briskly across his eyes, he left a tear in them when he looked up at his conductor. As Mr. Bumble gazed sternly upon him, it rolled down his cheek. It was followed by another and another. The child made a strong effort, but it was an unsuccessful one, and withdrawing his other hand from Mr. Bumble's, he covered his face with both, and wept till the tears sprung out from between his thin and bony fingers. "Well," exclaimed Mr. Bumble, stopping short and darting at his little charge a look of intense malignity. "Well, of all the ungratefullest and worst disposed boys as ever I see, Oliver, you are the—" No, sir," sobbed Oliver, clinging to the hand which held the well-known cane. No, sir. I will be good, indeed, I will, sir. I'm a very little boy, sir, and it is so what?" inquired Mr. Bumble in amazement. "So lonely, sir, so very lonely," cried the child. "Everybody hates me. Sir, don't be cross to me. I feel as if I had been cut here, sir, and it was all bleeding away." And the child beat his hand upon his heart, and looking into his companion's face with tears that were of real agony. Mr. Bumble regarded Oliver's piteous and helpless look with some astonishment for a few seconds, hemmed 3 or 4 times in a husky manner, and after muttering something about that troublesome cough, bid Oliver dry his eyes, be a good boy, and once more taking his hand, walked on with him in silence. The undertaker had just put up the shutters of his shop, and was making some entries in his day-book by the light of a most appropriately dismal candle, when Mr. Bumble entered. "Ah," said the undertaker, looking up from the book, and pausing in the middle of a word. "Is that you, Bumble?" "No one else, Mr. Sowerberry," replied the beadle. "Here, I've brought the boy." Oliver made a bow. "Oh, that's the boy, is it?" said the undertaker, raising the candle above his head to get a full glimpse of Oliver. "Mrs. Sowerberry, will you come here for a moment, my dear?" Mrs. Sowerberry emerged from a little room behind the shop, and presented the form of a short, thin, squeezed-up woman with a vixenous countenance. "My dear," said Mr. Sowerberry deferentially, "this is the boy from the workhouse that I told you of." Oliver bowed again. "Dear me," said the undertaker's wife, "he's very small." "Why, he is rather small," replied Mr. Bumble, looking at Oliver as if it were his fault that he wasn't bigger. "He is small, there's no denying it. But he'll grow, Mrs. Sowerberry, he'll grow." "Ah, I dare say he will," replied the lady pettishly. "On our victuals and our drink. I see no saving in parish children, not I, for they always cost more to keep than they're worth. However, men always think they know best. There, get downstairs, little bag of bones." With this, the undertaker's wife opened a side door, and pushed Oliver down a steep flight of stairs into a stone cell, damp and dark, forming the ante-room to the coal cellar, and denominated the kitchen, wherein sat a slatternly slatternly girl, in shoes down at heel, and blue worsted stockings, very much out of repair. "Here, Charlotte," said Mrs. Sowerberry, who had followed Oliver down. "Give this boy some of the cold bits that were put by for Trip. He hasn't come home since the morning, so he may go without 'em. I dare say he isn't too dainty to eat them, are you, boy?" Oliver, whose eyes had glistened at the mention of meat, and who was trembling with eagerness to devour it, replied in the negative, and a plateful of coarse, broken victuals was set before him. I wish some well-fed philosopher, whose meat and drink turn to gall within him, whose blood is ice, and whose heart is iron, could have seen Oliver Twist clutching at the dainty viands that the dog had neglected, and witnessed the horrible avidity with which he tore the bits asunder with all the ferocity of famine. There's only one thing I should like better, and that would be to see him making the same sort of meal himself, with the same relish. "Well," said the undertaker's wife, when Oliver had finished his supper, which she had regarded in silent horror, and with fearful auguries of his future appetite, "have you done?" There being nothing eatable within his reach, Oliver replied in the affirmative. "Then come with me," said Mrs. Sowerberry, taking up a dim and dirty lamp, "and leading the way upstairs. Your bed's under the counter. You won't mind sleeping among the coffins, I suppose? But it doesn't much matter whether you will or not, for you won't sleep anywhere else. Come, don't keep me here all night." Oliver lingered no longer, but meekly followed his new mistress, excessive. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver, weeping bitterly. "What are you crying for?" inquired the gentleman in the white waistcoat, and to be sure it was very extraordinary. What could he be crying for? "I hope you say your prayers every night," said another gentleman in a gruff voice, "and pray for the people who feed you and take care of you, like a Christian." "Yes, sir," stammered the boy. The gentleman who spoke last was unconsciously right. Rex room. I could snore to him of the spoony horn, with his Rosalie side in, by the neck I'm suttin' on, did Brian D. of Lynn. Jute. Bold oil and raw honey on me, when I can barely forstand a weird from Sturk to Phoenix in such a pat wat as your rudder down rodder, unheard of and unseen. Gut after meal, see you doomed. Mutt. Quite a grim, busaive a sec. Walk a dun blink roundward this abbilt still, and you school see how old ye plain of my elders hun free and ours, where wonny, to well Wimberley to Pewee or the Saltings, where Wibley city by law of Ishman, whereby a drought of signory, ice flow from his in the beginning, to whose finish there, punk, let Aram merge two races, sweet and brack, mordering rue, hither cratching estuards, they are insurgents, hence cool at ebb they requiesce. Countlessness of liver stories have nether fallen by this plage, fleck as flow flakes, litters from aloft, like a vast wizard all of worlds, now are all tombed to the mound. Ishgesh to Ishgesh, Erde from Erde, pride, O pride, thy prize. Jute. Stench. Mutt. Fiat, here and under light they, large by the small, and ere in night life also they strangely Babylon, the great grand hotel with tittle house, Alpon earwig drunken on ild, like as equal to an equal in this sound, cemetery which is the best love. Jute. Jmord. Mutt. Meldundeles, by the fierce wave behauded, despond snug, sung, and Thanacestros, mound have swole up them all. This earth of years is not save brick dust, and being hummus the same road turns. He who ruins may read it in all fours, Uxel, Newcastle, Trickastle, crumbling. Sell me sooth the fare for humbling, humbladdy fair, but speak it all so swiftly molder be in your wisht. Jute. Wisht? Mutt. The gaunt forficles with Omni the Fay. Jute. How? Mutt. Here is Vice King's grab. Jute. God! Mutt. Or you Stone Age, Jute, you? Jute. Oh, I am Thon Thor stock thick mud. Stoop. If you are ABCED minded to this claybook, what curious of signs, please stoop. In this alphabet, can you read, since we and thou had it out already, its world? It is the same told of all, many, miscegenations on miscegenations. Tycho, they lived and laughed and loved and left for sin. They thingdom is given to the Meads and Porsons, the Meandertale, a loss and again of our old Heidenburg in the days when head in clouds walked the earth, and the ignorance that implies impression, that knits knowledge, that finds the name form, that wets the wits that convey contacts, that sweetens sensation, that drives desire, that adheres to attachment, that dogs death, that bitches birth, that entails the insuance of existentiality. But with a rush out of his navel, reaching the reredos of Ramasbatam, a Terraclos vively on view this. Queer, and it continues to be quacky. A hatch, a celt, an ear share the porquoise of which was to casse the earth crust at all of ours, forwards, backwards, like Yelkson at the churn part. Here say figurines, bellicose, arming and mounting. Mounting and arming bellicose figurines, see here. For the rock, this little effigy is for a fire thing called a flint for fall. Face at the east, oh I fay. Face at the waist, oh you fie. Up wop and dump 'em ace to ace. When a part so peaty does duty for the holos, we soon grow to use of an all for a bit. Here, please to stoop. Our silverin, cued, petite peas of quite a pecuniary interest in as little as they are the pellets that make the tummy's pay roll. Right, rank, Ragnar rocks, and with these rocks orangutangos wrangled rough and ring-a-rung, wisha, hide ye that. Thick as for thorn, that's stuck in its toil like Thumb's fool's traitor. Thrust for vengeance. What a mince, old minnis, in almanacs. A meeting-heed horde of objects. Olives, beets, Kimmels, dollies, Alfreds, beaties, Cormacs and Daltons, owlets, eggs. Oh, stoop too, please. Are here, creakish from age and all now quite epsilon, and old woolly wobbly wers Hodworth and wiping grass. See the snake worms every side? Our Dublin is swarming in snakes. They came to our island from triangular touchy theatre beyond the wet prairie, reared up in the midst of the cargon of prohibitive pomfrix, but along landed Paddy Whippingham, and his garbage cans caught the creeps of them pricker than our who's here out of a man could quick up or what's us. So me divide, and some the lot, but the tally turns round the same ballyfusion. Racketeers and bottle luggers. Axe on thwax on thrax, axe and wise. One by one place, one by three dido and one before. Two nurses, one makes a plausible free and item behind, starting off with a big boa and three-legged calvers and evergreen jaddises with a mess in their mouths, and 100 field unleavened weight of liberorum cuie to con and we can till all horrors eve. What a Neanderthal tale to unfurl, and with what an end in view of squatter and anti-squatter, and post-prone anti-squatter. To say too, us to be every Tim, Nick, and Glary of us, sons of the sod, sons, little sons, yea, and little sons, when uses not to be, every Sue, Sis, and Sally of us, doctors of non-accusative answer, damn a damn to infinities. True, there was, in Nilos, Diobos, as yet no lumpant papier in the waste, and might mountain pen till groaned for the maces to let flee. All was of entreaty. You gave me a boot, signs on it, and I ate the wind. I quizzed you a quid, with for what? And you went to the quod. But the world mind is, was, and will be writing its own runes forever, man, on all matters that fall under the ban of our infra-rational senses. For the last meek camel, the heart vein throbbing between his eyebrows, has still to moor before the tomb of his cousin Charmin, where his date is tethered by the palm that's hers. But the horn, the drinking, the day of dread are not now. A bone, a pebble, a ramskin, chip 'em, chop 'em, cut them up always, leave them to Terra cook in the mothering pot, and get a morgue with his Cro-Magnon charter. Ting fast and great primer must once for omnibus step rubber-ricked out of the WordPress, else is there no virtue more in all Koran. For that, the rapt one warns, is what a papper is made of, hides and hints and misses and prints, till ye finally, though not yet end-like, meet with the acquaintance of Mr. Typus, Mistress Tope, and all the little typo-topies, Philstup. So, you need hardly spell me how every word will be bound over to carry 70 top typsical readings throughout the book of double-ends ginned. May his forehead be darkened with mud who would sunder, till daleth Malamona, who oped it closeth there, the door. Cry not yet. There's many a smile to non-dumb with shitty maids per man, sir, and the park so dark by candlelight. But look what you have in your hand, self. The movables are scrawling in motions, marching all of them ago, and pit-pat and zing-zang for every busy eerie wig's a bit of tory tale to tell. Once upon a time, and two's behind their lead asleep, and three's among the shrubbery beds, and the chicks pick their teeth, and the domy key he began. You can ask your ass if he believes it, and so cutty me only wallops have heels. That one of a wife with faulty barnets, for then was the age when hoops ran high, on a no-arch and a top-wife, of a palm-full grave and a family of levity, or of golden use that wanted gilding, or of what the mischief made a man to do. Mal married dad, he was reversed so gassed by the frisk of her frask, and her pretty preek. Nay, fay, she's a legay, this snaky woman. From that trippery toe, expecton pelic, veil, Valentine eyes. She's the very best when he blows, nay on turn. Good. Flow in, flow, and ho, she's sure it was her, not we. But lay it easy, gentle mind, we are in reading of a no-re-wig. So weeny teen, come see, he to eats, if he knew it. Listen, I'm doing it. Hark, the corn entreats, and the lark notes prittle. It was of a night, late, long time agone, in an old stan eld, when Adam was delvin and his madam in spinning water silks, when Moke Mont naughty man was ever bully, and the first real ribber-rubber that ever had her anyway everybody to his love, saking eyes, and every Billy lived alove with everybody else, and Jarl Von Hoother had his burnt head high up in his lamp-house, laying cold hands on himself, and his two little Jiminies, cousins of Arn, Christopher and Hilary, were kick-a-heeling their dummy on the oilcloth floor on his home rye high castle and earthen house. and be Dermot. And be Dermot, who come to keep of his inn only the niece of his in-law, the Prince Queen, and the Prince Queen pulled a rosy one, and made her wit foreign the door, and she lit up in fireland was ablaze, and spoke she to the door in her petty prison, mark the wands, why am I a look a lot alike a poss of porter peas, and that was how the skirmishes began, but the dour handward her grace and douch shut. So her grace so malice kidnapped up the Jiminy Christopher, and into the Shandy westernest she rain, and Jarl van Hooter war lest after her with some soft dove's gal, stop, deef, stop, come back to my errand, stop. But she swore did him unlikelihood, and there was a Branwell that same Sabbath night of falling angles somewhere in Erio, and the Prince Queen went for her 40 years' walk in Torlemond, and she washed the blessings of the love spots off the chimney with soap silver settles, and she had her 4 hours masters for to taunch him his tickles, and she converted him to the one sure all good, and he became a luterman. So then she started to reign, and be Red Tom, and be Red Tom. She was back again at Jarl van Hooter's in a brace of Simers, and the Jimmy with her and her pinafore lace at night at another time. And where did she come but to the bar of his Bristolry? And Jarl van Hooter had his beareth all heels drowned in this all shaking warm hands with himself. And the Jiminy Hillary and the dummy in their first infancy were below on the tear sheet, ringing and coughing like Brodar and his there, and the Prince Queen nipped a paly one and lit up again, and the red cocks flew flacking from the hill combs. And she made her witter before the wicked, saying, Mark they twy, why do I am a look alike to poss of porter peas? And shut, says the wicked hen, wording her majesty. So her majesty aforethought set down a Jiminy and took up a Jiminy, and all the lily pathways to woman's land she rain, and Jarl van Hooter bleated after her with a loud fingal game, Stop, dome, stop, come back with my earring, stop, but the Prince Queen swear I did, am liking it. And there was a wild old Granuaile that larmsy night of star shooting somewhere near you, and the Prince Queen went for her 40 years' walk in Turtlemeen, and she punched the curses of Crom Cruel with the nail of a top into the Jiminy, and she had her 4 larksical money trees to touch him his tears, and she porvorded him to the one certain all secure, and he became a Christian. So then she started reigning, and with a pair of changers, be Dom Ter, she was back again at Jarl van Hooter's and the Larry Hill with her under her opera-mets. And why would she halt at all, if not by the ward of his mansion home with another nice lace for the 3rd charm? And Jarl van Hooter had his hurricane hips up to his pantry box, ruminating his hold 4 stomachs. Dare, oh dare! And the Jimmy tougher trees and the tummy were beloved on the water cloth, kissing and spitting and rugging and pugging like a Mav Patchy and Knave Bride in her 2nd infancy. And the Prince Queen picked a blank and lit out on the valleys lay twinkling, and she made her wittest in front of the archway of Tri-Hump, asking, Mark the trees, why do I am a look like 3 pulsopir peas? But that was how the skirmishes ended up, for like the Campbells a coming with a fork lance and lightning, Jarl van Hooter Bonerges himself, the old terror of the dames, came hip-hop, handy-hap, out through the pike-opened archway of his 3 shuttened castles, in his broad ginger hat, and his civic cholera, and his olive buff hemmed, and his bull bragging stocking gloves, and his low black breeks, and cat, and his fur-framed panacular cumbats like a Rud Yellen Crumberline or Anjuman, in his violet indoganation to the whole length of the strong of his bowman's bill, and he clopped his rude hand to his easy hitch, and he ordered in his thick spick-spock for her to shut up shop dappy, and the doopy shot the shutter clip, Cod huskaran bargarai gaigorle lay or gram grim can heart rum and thunder run the dundra the fat the lily bomb can none. And they all drank free. For one man in his armor was a fat match always for any girl's undershirts, and that was the first piece of alliterative porthery in all the flamed, floody, flatuous world. How cursey the Tyler made a sweet unclose to the Narweland capital. Saw for shalt thou see, be town ye and be. The Prinquian was to hold her dummy ship, and the Jimenez was to keep the peace wave, and Van Hooter was to get the wind up. Thus the hearsomeness of the burgher felicitates the whole of the polis. O phoenix culprit, ex nihilo malo comes Michaelmas bonum, hill, real, ones in company, billeted lest be proud of, breast high and bestride, only for that these will not breathe upon Noronesian or Iranian the secretest of their sore closeness. Quarry Celix, home fry no answer, undijantian venstines, Livia no answer. Walking cap is on him, frowned. Ah, Durant, he would eavesdrip, were it most at hand, were it din of bottles in the far ear. Murk, his veils are darkling. With lips she lifteth to him all to time of thuck on thock and thou on thou. She, he, she, ho, she, ha, to la, Herr Fluke, if he could bad twig her, impalpabant he appears, the sound waves are his buffeteers, they trump him with their trumpets. The wave of Rory and the wave of Hushed and the wave of Ha Hard and the wave of never heard them, horse luggers and listless to mine. Land loft by his nigh-born mistress, and perpetrified in his offsprung. Zabes and suckers, the moaning pipers, could tell him to his face back, the loathly one whose lobe we are devourers of, how but for his hold halibut, or her to her putter poof, the libe palip one whose libe we drink at, how biff for her titty wink of a tin-o-fall, windfall, our breed and washer givers. There would not be a holy spire on the town, or a vestal flouting in the dock, nay, to make plain avowals, nor a you nor an I to play cash in Novo Nilibud, but swamp light by swamp lights. Nor a tool otal, and naughty hint to the conveyance. He dug in and dug out by the skill of his tilth for himself and all belonging to him, and he sweated his crew, I love you, beneath his auspice for the living, and he earned his dread, that dragon volant, and he made loose for us and delivered us to Bull Weevil's amain, that mighty liberator, unfruchikta uru wakru, and begad he did, our ancestor most worshipful, till he thought of a better one in his window-weir's house, with that blush mantle upon him for ears, to ears, and would again could whispering grassies wake him, and may again, when the fiery bird Decembers, and will again, if so he be sooth, by elder to his youngers, shall be said, have you wines for my wedding? Did you bring bride and bedding? Will you whoop for my deading? Is a wake? Uz good ga bagam? Ana muk andul, did you drink me dornow? Now, be easy, good Finnemore, Mr. Finnemore, sir. and take your leisure like a god on pension, and don't be walking abroad. Sure, you'd only lose yourself in Heliopolis now the way your roads in Capelvaster are that winding there after the cavalry, the Northumbrian, and the Fifth Barrow, and Wilding's Raid, and the Bournemore, and wet your feet maybe with the foggy dews abroad, meeting some sick old bankrupt, or the cutter trick's donkey with his shoe hanging, clackada chackada concada, or a slut snoring with an impure infant on a bench. 'Twould turn you against life, so 'twould, and the weather's that mean too. To part from Devlin is hard as Nugent knew. To leave the clean tanglesome one loosier than its neighbour in franchisable fields, but let your ghost have no grievance. You're better off, sir, where you are, prime signed in the full of your dress, blood eagle waistcoat and all, remembering your shapes and sizes on the pillow of your baby curls under your sycamore by the killed water where the Tories' clay will scare the varmints. And have all you want, pouch, gloves, flask, briquet, kerchief, ring, and amberula, the whole treasure of the pyre, in the land of souls with Homin and Bron Barak and Pol Olonan and no bucket Nosler and the Gungus Khan. And we'll be coming here, the ombre players, to rack your gravel and bringing you presents, won't we, Finians? And it isn't our spittle we'll stint you of, is it, druids? Not shouty little imagits, penny dirts and dodge my eyes you buy in the sooty stores, but offerings of the field. Myliodores, that Dr. Fireteeth, the maddest man, taught to good in you. Pulpy pap's a passport out, and honey is the holiest thing ever was. Hive, comb, and earwax, the food for glory. Mind you keep the pot of your nectar cup may yield too light. And some goat's milk, sir, like the maid used to bring you. Your fame is spreading like Basilico's ointment since the Fintang Lallers piped you overboard, and there's whole households beyond the Bothnians, and they're calling names after you. The men, here's always talking of you sitting around on the pig's cheek under the sacred roof tree, over the bowls of memory where every hollow holds a hollow with a pledge till the drinks in the salmon house, and admiring to our super shillal where the palm sweat on high is the mark of your manument. All the toyth picks ever Arinasians chewed on are Chips Chapter 8. Mobilis immobile. This forcible abduction, so roughly carried out, was accomplished with the rapidity of lightning. I shivered all over. Whom had we to deal with? No doubt some new sort of pirates, who explored the sea in their own way. Hardly had the narrow panel closed upon me, when I was enveloped in darkness. My eyes, dazzled with the outer light, could distinguish nothing. I felt my naked feet cling to the rungs of an iron ladder. Ned Land and Conseil, firmly seized, followed me. At the bottom of the ladder, a door opened, and shut after us immediately with a bang. We were alone. Where, I could not say, hardly imagine. All was black, and such a dense black that, after some minutes, my eyes had not been able to discern even the faintest glimmer. Meanwhile, Ned Land, furious at these proceedings, gave free vent to his indignation. "Confound it!" cried he. "Here are people who come up to the Scotch for hospitality. They only just miss being cannibals. I should not be surprised at it, but I declare that they shall not eat me without my protesting." "Calm yourself, friend Ned, calm yourself," replied Conseil, quietly. "Do not cry out before you are hurt. We are not quite done for yet." "Not quite," sharply replied the Canadian, "but pretty near, at all events. Things look black. Happily, my bowie knife I have still, and I can always see well enough to use it. The first of these pirates who lays a hand on me—" "Do not excite yourself, Ned," I said to the harpooner, "and do not compromise us by useless violence. Who knows that they will not listen to us? Let us rather try to find out where we are." I groped about. In 5 steps I came to an iron wall, made of plates bolted together. Then turning back, I struck against a wooden table, near which were ranged several stools. The boards of this prison were concealed under a thick mat, which deadened the noise of the feet. The bare walls revealed no trace of window or door. Conseil, going round the reverse way, met me, and when we went back to the middle of the cabin, which measured about 20 feet by 10. As to its height, Ned Land, in spite of his own great height, could not measure it. Half an hour had already passed without our situation being bettered, when the dense darkness suddenly gave way to extreme light. Our prison was suddenly lighted, that is to say, it became filled with a luminous matter, so strong that I could not bear it at first. In its whiteness and intensity, I recognized that electric light which played round the submarine boat like a magnificent phenomenon of phosphorescence. After shutting my eyes involuntarily, I opened them, and saw that this luminous agent came from a half-globe, unpolished, placed in the roof of the cabin. "At last one can see!" cried Ned Land, who, knife in hand, stood on the defensive. "Yes, but we are still in the dark about ourselves." "Let master have patience," said the imperturbable Conseil. The sudden lightening of the cabin enabled me to examine it minutely. It only contained a table and 5 stools. The invisible door might be hermetically sealed. No noise was heard. All seemed dead in the interior of this boat. Did it move? Did it float on the surface of the ocean? Or did it dive into its depth? I could not guess. A noise of bolts was now heard. The door opened, and the 2 men appeared. One was short, very muscular, broad-shouldered, with robust limbs, strong head, an abundance of black hair, thick mustache, a quick, penetrating look, and the vivacity which characterizes the population of southern France. The second stranger merits a more detailed description. I made out his prevailing qualities directly. Self-confidence, because his head was well set on his shoulders, and his black eyes looked around with cold assurance. Calmness, for his skin, rather, said the beadle, as he thrust his thumb and forefinger into the proffered snuff-box of the undertaker, which was an ingenious little model of a patent coffin. "I say you'll make your fortune, Mr. Sowerberry," repeated Mr. Bumble, tapping the undertaker on the shoulder in a friendly manner with his cane.